house across the street, diagonally across the street, was being renovated. Does that sound familiar? And any time I would try to talk to my daughter, there would be blah, 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 jackhammering. Now, I didn't mention it because it wasn't germane to the book. It turns out that those people renovating it were a couple who were sort of Hollywood producers. Yeah, the music's right on cue. They were Hollywood producers and very big, famous Hollywood producers. And they happened to get hold of this article, and they said, oh, wait a minute. Joel and Izzy, isn't that the name of the guy across the street from us? And they came over and knocked on my door, and they said, Joel, we just read this article. We have to make a movie. Well, we called Tom, and then we're going to talk to Steven. This is the way Hollywood people are. I said, what? Now, it's a very weird thing when you've written this article about your life crumbling, that you're in the bottom of the pit of futility, right, wallowing, and suddenly somebody's coming to you and saying, we got to make a movie. They said, we need an ending. I said, yeah, you need an ending. Any ideas? I can think of some good ones, but they're not true. So because at this point I had no voice return. So I sat down and I thought, well, maybe I'll write a movie. You know, this knocked on the door. And I began to write, and then I started to look at what happens when you go to write a movie, and I found that that by the time you write a script and gets turned into a movie, it gets shredded and mixed up. And somebody who I knew in the movie business said, by the time they make this movie, you won't be a storyteller who loses your voice. You're going to be an Irish paratrooper in World War II who falls behind enemy lines, falls in love with his nurse, and gets a case of venereal disease. He said, do yourself a favor, write the book first so people can say the book was better, right? So I sat down to do this, and at this point, I mean, this was, you know, as my voice had begun to get returns, I learned about the surgery. I had the chance to meet, to sort of, or not to meet, to sort of send out my article to different agents, and understand. This, I thought, was the best thing I'd ever written. And if you've ever written or had thoughts of being a writer, you know, you one time it works and you get it right. I look back at this now and I say, you know what? This could use some work. But back then I felt it was I had really just nailed it. And I thought, all I have to do is expand this into a book. So I sent this out to different Hollywood agents, which is what you do when you want, or different New York agents. Hollywood agents for movie, New York agents for book. And I sent it out, and I got one who said, yes, this sounds good. Yeah, write it. I said, okay, all right, I'll write it. By now my voice had come back. I had an idea for an ending. Now that book was easy to write for the first 2,500 pages. The hard part was scrapping those a line at a time. When you write a book and you fall in love with it, right, you lose piece by piece by piece. And it's just a little like cutting flesh off, is how I felt. And finding that little book, because it's not a long book, my book, finding that little book within there, that was the next 4 years' work. And what did I have to do? I had to learn certain lessons. You see, first I loved this article, and I wanted to include everything and just add stuff between it to expand it all out. But the article has the wrong tone. Did you hear that? This is bitter, this is sour, and you know, in this world, it turns out there's an awful lot of misery. Every one of us knows somebody who's suffering, and every one of us in life will suffer. Right? And so just sort of misery, even if it's done in a clever, funny way, didn't work. This was hard, because I had to let go. And as I kept writing and rewriting and expanding on this article to turn into my book, my editor in New York kept saying, the tone is wrong. You got to work on the tone. And as I went back and tried to work on the tone, she said, it's too long, make it shorter. And it was 100 pages of writing, and I said, I'll make it shorter, and it came out 150. She said, even shorter, it came out 200. She said, even shorter, it came out 300, right? It was just going completely the wrong way. because I wasn't listening. I lacked humility, right? These same lessons I was destined to learn again. And finally, I realized, yet another irony, if I need more ironies, I just couldn't find my voice. I could talk, but I couldn't find my voice. So at a certain point, something happened. And this is so often in life. What happened was, I hit a wall. I could go no further. I gave up. And just as in the book, with the help of Lenny, and with the help of my mother, and with the help of my wife, when you give up, something happens. It springs forward. And I began to find that story. You know, sometimes a story has to be the one written by a broken heart. And I had to let go of this article, word by word, line by line. So now, the only thing from this article that remains in my book is one line, and that is, people make plans. Who'd have thunk? There it is again. So I slogged through it, and I began to turn around, began to get shorter. I let stuff go. Let your, Hemingway said your trick to writing is you've got to kill your darlings. Any writing class you're in, they'll tell you that. And I had to do exactly that. Let go of all these little pieces, because I realized what I need to do was I need to tell a story that gives people reason to go on. Not a story of bitterness, not a story of anger. And I had to find that within me, and it was there. It was hidden behind the bitterness. And that's why I use those chapter opening stories. Because I realized if I can somehow use those to make it universal, that people connect to it as they hear a story, then they can open up and hear my story and maybe get something good out of it. Because a story is like that pearl inside an oyster. We go through difficult times, and we suffer, and we come up with a little gem. That's what those chapter opening stories are. And just like a gem of any sort, if it's like, say, a diamond, there's another kind of gem. You look at it in one light, it's one way, another light, it's another way. So those opening stories seem to reflect what's happening in those chapters, but in fact, they reflect a lot more. You just see them in one light. And this is what happens with stories, why I love stories. When I was a kid, one of my favorite storytellers, of course, my grandpa Izzy, was the mythical storyteller, but in lieu of his stories, I listened to stories of Bill Cosby. Does anybody remember Bill Cosby records? Well, I should go back. Does anybody remember records? Big black CDs like this. He used to say, he said, Noah, right? What's in our, and you remember, hey, it's Fat Albert. And he had one little line, he said, when I was a kid, my grandpa would sit me down and say, now, William, I'm going to tell you something. And he'd hold up a quarter. And I'd sit at his feet, and I would listen. And I would listen for 3 days, because I knew that no matter what he said, at the end of it, I was going to get that quarter. Right? And I thought, metaphorically, that's how stories work. We have the idea, somebody sits and talks, maybe a parent, maybe a grandparent, and we settle back in and say, oh yeah, we're going to get a quarter at the end. There's something good at the end of this. And that's what was missing from here. This had just pain and loss. I had to look through and begin to really fully appreciate the gifts I'd been given. And they were gifts. So in the writing, moved all the way forward. And Melissa had told me some people ask questions about my wife, Tali, and her role in this. And I have to say, to give credit where credit is due, her role in this is much larger than you would think. And in fact, it's much larger than I would think. A good deal of the wisdom from this book comes from her. The old saying about being wise, it's easy to be wise, just think of something stupid and don't say it, right? So here's what had happened in my book. I had written and written and rewritten and rewritten, and I was getting close to there, and I wrote it with my wife's name